I'm Clara Wren, and I was 25 when I discovered that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who remembers you exist. Until 3 months ago, I believed the Taylors loved me like their own daughter. Then a single phone call from their property manager changed everything. "Pack your things, Clara. The guesthouse lease expired yesterday." My hands trembled as I held that eviction notice. The Taylors were touring Italian vineyards, posting pictures of sunset dinners while I scrambled to find somewhere to sleep. For 6 years, I'd been their live-in helper, their surrogate daughter, their trusted confidante. Margaret Taylor used to say, "Clara, dear, you're the daughter we never had." What she didn't know was that I'd been secretly paying her medical bills for 2 years, draining my savings to keep her treatments private from Richard. But here's what makes this story even more unbelievable. Who do you think called the property manager to terminate my lease? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where this all began, to the day I met the Taylors. I was 19, clutching a worn leather journal, the only thing of value I owned, standing outside their Pacific Heights mansion with nothing but hope and a desperate need to belong somewhere. The journal had been a gift from my last foster, Mother Mrs. Chen, who'd slipped it into my hands the day I aged out of the system. "Write your story, Clara," she'd whispered. "Someday you'll need to remember how far you've come." I'd written exactly 3 entries before meeting the Taylors. The first page read, "Day 1 of real life. Scared but ready." Maybe this is where my story really starts. I remember walking up those steep San Francisco streets, my secondhand interview clothes clinging to me in the coastal fog. The Taylor estate sat like a jewel among the Victorian houses, its cream-colored facade an emerald, garden gates promising something I'd never had: permanence. The brass nameplate read "The Taylors" in elegant script, and just seeing those words made my chest tighten with longing. Richard Taylor answered the door himself that first day, which surprised me. I'd expected a housekeeper or assistant. He was tall and silver-haired, wearing the kind of expensive casual clothes that spoke of old money, pressed khakis and a navy blazer that probably cost more than I'd spent on food that month. His handshake was firm, professional, but his eyes were kind. "You must be Clara," he said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Margaret's been looking forward to meeting you." The house took my breath away. Hardwood floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings lined the walls. Not reproductions, but the kind of original art I'd studied in my 2 years at art school before the money ran out. The living room overlooked the bay, floor-to-ceiling windows framing Alcatraz Island and the Golden Gate Bridge like a postcard. But it was Margaret who changed everything. She swept into the room wearing a silk blouse the color of morning sky. Her silver hair pinned back with what I later learned was her grandmother's pearl comb. Despite being 68, she moved with the grace of someone who'd once commanded attention at society galas. Her illness wasn't visible yet. This was before the treatments, before the gradual fading that would come to define our relationship. "Clara, darling." She extended both hands to me, a gesture so warm it nearly brought tears to my eyes. "Richard told me about your situation, and I simply won't hear of you struggling alone. We have far too much space in this old house, and frankly, I could use the company." The guest house was a dream I hadn't dared to imagine. Tucked behind the main house, connected by a stone pathway lined with lavender and rosemary, it was like something from a fairy tale. 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen with a window that caught the morning sun, and a living area with built-in bookshelves that Margaret had already filled with art books she thought I'd enjoy. "I know you had to leave art school," she said, running her fingers along the spine of a Monet collection. "But that doesn't mean you have to leave art behind. This could be your studio space, too." I wrote in my journal that night. Day 1 with the Taylors. Margaret called me darling, and Richard made sure I had everything I needed. They asked about my dreams, not my past. Maybe this is what family feels like. The arrangement was simple. I'd help Margaret with daily tasks as her rheumatoid arthritis progressed, manage some household scheduling, and assist with Richard's home office organization. In exchange, I had a home, a small salary, and something I'd never experienced: stability. Those early months were golden. Margaret and I would spend afternoons in the garden, her teaching me about the heirloom roses her mother had planted 50 years earlier. She'd share stories of her youth, of dancing at the Palace Hotel and raising their son James, who was already 31 and establishing his own law practice. "James is brilliant," she'd say with pride, though I detected something else in her voice, distance, perhaps disappointment. But he's always been so focused on achievement. Sometimes I wonder if we push too hard. I met James for the first time at a family dinner 3 months after I'd moved in. He was handsome in that effortless way of people born to privilege, tall, like his father, with dark hair and the kind of confidence that comes from never doubting your place in the world. But there was something cold about him, a calculating quality that made me uncomfortable. "So you're the live-in help," he said, when Margaret introduced me, his tone not unkind but certainly not warm. "Clara is family," Margaret corrected sharply, and the look that passed between mother and son told me this wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation. As the years passed, I became indispensable. Margaret's condition worsened gradually, and I was there for every doctor's appointment, every flare-up, every night she couldn't sleep from pain. Richard traveled frequently for his law firm, and James remained distant, calling dutifully every Sunday but rarely visiting. I coordinated Margaret's medications, drove her to physical therapy, and learned to cook the dishes that didn't aggravate her condition. When she was too tired to maintain her beloved garden, I took over, researching each plant, learning which fertilizers worked best, keeping alive the legacy her mother had created. But it was the quiet moments I treasured most. Margaret would sit in her favorite armchair while I sketched at the window, both of us content in comfortable silence. Sometimes she'd ask to see my drawings, always responding with genuine enthusiasm. "You have such a gift for capturing emotion," she'd say, studying a portrait I'd drawn of Richard reading his morning paper. "You see people, Clara. Really see them. That's rare." I should have noticed the signs earlier. The way Margaret began insisting I keep all receipts for her medical expenses for tax purposes. How she'd grown quiet during her treatments, staring out the clinic windows with an expression I couldn't read. The conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. By my 24th birthday, Margaret's medical costs had escalated beyond what insurance covered. Experimental treatments, specialized therapies, medications that weren't approved yet, but showed promise. I didn't think twice about using my savings to help. She was family, and family took care of each other. I opened a separate account and quietly began covering what I could. A treatment here, a consultation there. Margaret never asked, and I never told her. But I made sure she got the care she needed, even when it meant eating ramen noodles for dinner and wearing the same 3 outfits to rotate through the week. The house felt different during those months. Richard seemed more stressed, working longer hours. James visited even less frequently, and Margaret grew more fragile, not just physically but emotionally. She'd hold my hand during her treatments and whisper, "What would I do without you, Clara? You're the daughter I always wanted." Those words sustained me through the financial strain, through the worry, through the gradual realization that I was watching someone I loved slip away despite all my efforts to save her. The last year was the hardest. Margaret's lucid moments became precious gifts between periods of confusion and pain. I coordinated with hospice workers, managed her medications around the clock, and held her hand through the darkest hours. Richard and James were grateful but distant, as if her illness was something happening to me rather than to all of us. I wrote less frequently in my journal during this time, but when I did, the entries reflected my exhaustion and growing sense of isolation. Margaret called me her daughter again today, but James looked at me like I was presumptuous for sitting beside her bed. Am I family or am I staff? Sometimes I can't tell anymore. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with me holding one hand and Richard holding the other. James arrived 20 minutes too late, having been stuck in a client meeting. He couldn't leave. The funeral was beautiful and painful, filled with people who spoke of Margaret's grace and generosity. Several mentioned how devoted I'd been, how much comfort I'd brought her final years. She loved you like a daughter, her oldest friend told me at the reception. She used to call you her greatest blessing. After the funeral, the house felt hollow. Richard retreated into work. James disappeared back to his own life, and I continued, managing household tasks that suddenly felt meaningless. The garden still needed tending, but Margaret wasn't there to admire the roses or discuss which varieties to plant for next season. I should have realized then that my role in the family had been tied entirely to Margaret. Without her, I was simply the help again. Which brings me back to that devastating phone call 3 months later, as I stood in the guest house that had been my sanctuary for 6 years, holding an eviction notice while the people I'd called family toured European vineyards without a thought for the woman who'd sacrificed everything to care for the matriarch they'd buried and seemingly forgotten. Looked around at the space I'd called home, at the art books Margaret had given me, at the easel I'd barely used because I'd been too busy caring for everyone else. My leather journal sat on the desk, mostly empty despite Mrs. Chen's encouragement, to document my journey. Time to start writing again, I thought, because this story was far from over. The eviction notice felt like paper made of ice in my trembling hands. 24 hours. That's how long I had to pack 6 years of my life and find somewhere else to exist. I sat on the bed that had been mine for so long, staring at the official letterhead that made everything brutally real. Lease termination effective immediately due to non-payment and expiration of rental agreement, it read in cold, legal language. But that couldn't be right. I'd never paid rent for the guest house. It had been part of my compensation package, part of being family. I called the property management company immediately, my fingers shaking as I dialed. Peninsula Property Management, this is Jennifer. This is Clara Wren, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I received an eviction notice for the guest house at 2847 Vallejo Street, but I think there's been a mistake. I'm not a tenant. I live here as part of my employment with the Taylor family. A pause. The sound of typing. Let me pull up that file. Okay, I see the issue here. Miss Wren, according to our records, your lease agreement was established in 2018 and was set to expire on March 15th of this year. The property owner chose not to renew. Property owner? But the Taylors are the property owners, yes. Mr. Richard Taylor contacted us last month to begin the termination process. He said you'd been informed. The world tilted. He called you? Yes, ma'am. March 2nd. He was very clear that the lease would not be renewed, and that you needed to vacate by today. I'm surprised you weren't given more notice. That's not typical for our company, but Mr. Taylor insisted on the accelerated timeline. I ended the call and sat in stunned silence. Richard had called them, while I was still bringing him his morning coffee and organizing his case files. While I was still tending Margaret's garden and keeping her memory alive in every carefully maintained rosebush. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible. I tried calling Richard's cell phone, knowing it would go straight to voicemail. The Taylors had left for their month-long European tour the day after I received the eviction notice, a coincidence that now felt carefully orchestrated. Hi, you've reached Richard Taylor. I'm traveling abroad until April 20th. For urgent legal matters, please contact my associate. I hung up and tried Margaret's old number, forgetting for a moment that she was gone. The automated message, that her line had been disconnected, hit me like a physical blow. There was no one to call, no one to explain that this had to be a mistake. I looked around the guest house with new eyes, seeing it not as my sanctuary, but as evidence of my own naivety. Had I ever truly belonged here? Or had I just been playing house in someone else's space? The art books Margaret had given me suddenly felt like borrowed items I'd failed to return. Packing was surreal. 6 years of life fit into 4 suitcases and 3 boxes. My clothes, my few books, some kitchen items, and the leather journal that had documented so little of my actual journey. I held Margaret's photograph, the one of us in the garden last spring, and almost packed it before realizing it wasn't really mine to keep. But I kept it anyway. As evening approached, I loaded everything into my 12-year-old Honda Civic and drove away from Vallejo Street for what I knew would be the last time. I didn't look back at the main house, couldn't bear to see the windows that had once felt like home. My first night homeless, I parked in Golden Gate Park near the Japanese tea garden. I'd chosen the spot because it felt peaceful, somewhere Margaret and I had walked during her better days. The irony wasn't lost on me, seeking comfort in a place that reminded me of the woman whose family had just discarded me. I reclined the driver's seat as far back as it would go and covered myself with the quilt Margaret had given me for Christmas 2 years ago. For those chilly San Francisco nights, she'd said, her eyes twinkling. I wondered if she'd known then that I'd eventually need it for warmth in my car. Sleep was impossible. Every sound made me jump. Footsteps on the nearby path, car doors, slamming, the distant hum of late-night traffic. I wasn't just afraid of being discovered. I was afraid of disappearing entirely. Without an address, without a family, without a place in anyone's life, what was I? Around 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and drove to an all-night diner in the Mission District. The waitress, a woman with kind eyes and graying roots, didn't question why I ordered just coffee and sat in the corner booth for 4 hours, staring at my phone and hoping someone, anyone, would think to check on me. No one did. As dawn broke over the city, I made a decision that would define everything that came next. I drove to Bank of America and requested my account statements for the past 2 years. What I found there told a story I'd been too selfless to see clearly while living it. Spread across my kitchen table in a McDonald's, the only place I could find with decent lighting and free Wi-Fi at 7 a.m., were dozens of statements showing the slow drain of my savings. 500 here for Margaret's physical therapy sessions, 800 there for a specialist consultation, 1,200 for the experimental treatment that wasn't covered by insurance. Over 2 years, I'd spent nearly $37,000 of my own money on Margaret's care. Money I'd earned from freelance graphic design work I did late at night after my household duties were finished. Money I'd saved by eating pasta and peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. Money I'd intended to eventually use to return to art school and finish my degree. Margaret had never asked me to pay for anything, but she'd never asked me to stop either. The statements told another story, too. Several of the checks I'd written to medical providers had been deposited into accounts that were then immediately transferred to other accounts. It took me 3 hours and several phone calls to trace the pattern, but eventually, the truth emerged. Richard had known about my payments all along. Not only had he known, but he'd been tracking them through his own accounting system. Every payment I'd made had been logged and categorized in his financial records as household medical expenses, third party. He'd been watching me drain my savings to care for his wife, and he'd said nothing. I called the bank's fraud prevention line, thinking, there must be some mistake. No, ma'am, the representative explained patiently. These transfers were all legitimate. The account holder, that would be Mr. Taylor, had full visibility into all transactions. In fact, our records show he requested detailed monthly statements, specifically for these medical payment accounts. He was monitoring my spending? It appears so. He would have received notification every time you made a payment over $500. I hung up and stared at the evidence spread before me. Richard Taylor, successful attorney and careful man of business, had watched me spend my life, savings on his wife's medical care. He'd known I was sacrificing my future for Margaret's present, and he'd allowed it to continue. More than allowed it. He'd seemingly counted on it. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I found Margaret's medical bills from the last 6 months of her life. Bills I'd never seen because they'd been sent directly to Richard's office. Bills that showed her insurance had actually covered far more than I'd realized. Many of the treatments I'd paid for had been reimbursed to the Taylor family account weeks later. They'd never needed my money. But they'd taken it anyway. I drove to the Taylor estate that afternoon, parking across the street and staring at the house that had been my world for 6 years. The garden I'd maintained looked perfect. The landscaping service Richard had hired was doing excellent work. The windows gleamed, and I could see the cleaning service moving efficiently through the rooms. Everything I'd done for this family had been replaced by professionals within weeks of my departure. I wasn't family. I'd been free labor who was foolish enough to pay for the privilege. The realization should have destroyed me. Instead, something else began to grow in its place. Something I'd never felt before because I'd never needed it. Anger. Clean. Clarifying. Anger that burned away the confusion and self-doubt. I pulled out my phone and composed a text message to James Taylor. Of all of them, he was the one I thought might be honest with me. James, this is Clara. I need to know the truth about my eviction. Did you know your father terminated my lease while you were all in Europe? Did you know I spent my savings on your mother's medical bills? Please just tell me the truth. His response came 3 hours later. Clara, I'm sorry you found out this way. Dad said he'd explained everything before we left. Mom left specific instructions about your situation. She didn't want you to sacrifice any more for our family. The eviction was her idea. I read the message 5 times before it sank in. Margaret had ordered my eviction. The woman who'd called me her daughter, who'd held my hand through her final weeks, who'd whispered that she didn't know what she'd do without me. She'd arranged for me to be thrown out of my home while her family toured Europe. But James's message didn't feel complete. There was something else. Something he wasn't saying. I called him directly. Clara. He answered on the first ring, his voice heavy with something that might have been guilt. Why, James? Why would Margaret do this to me? A long pause. She found out about the money, Clara. About what you'd been paying. She felt like you were staying out of obligation, not love. She thought the only way you'd ever build your own life was if we forced you to leave. That's not true. I loved her. I loved all of you. I know. But Mom thought... She thought she was setting you free. By making me homeless? Another pause. There's more, Clara. She left you something. But Dad has been handling the estate, and he thinks... The line went dead. I tried calling back, but James didn't answer. That night, I slept in my car again, this time in the parking lot of a 24-hour Walmart in Daly City. I was no longer just homeless. I was emotionally adrift, trying to reconcile the Margaret I'd loved with the woman who'd arranged my abandonment as an act of supposed kindness. I pulled out my leather journal and wrote my first entry in months, day. One of being forgotten. Margaret thought she was freeing me, but freedom feels a lot like falling. I loved them, but love isn't always enough. Maybe it never was. Tomorrow I figure out how to survive. Tonight I figure out how to forgive. As I closed the journal, I realized something had changed. For 6 years I'd defined myself in relation to the Taylor family. Margaret's caregiver, Richard's assistant, the grateful girl they'd rescued from the foster system. Now, for the first time since I was 19, I was just Clara Wren, and I had no idea who that was supposed to be. But I was about to find out. Learning to be homeless is like learning a foreign language. You think you understand the basics until you're thrust into situations where fluency becomes a matter of survival. My first week on the streets taught me that everything I thought I knew about being without a home came from movies and the carefully distant sympathy we show when we drop change into outstretched cups. The reality was both harsher and more human than I'd imagined. My car became my mobile headquarters. I learned the schedules of parking enforcement officers, discovered which neighborhoods had overnight parking without time limits, and mapped every public restroom within a 30-mile radius. The Honda's trunk held my suitcases like a tragic hope chest, while the back seat served as my bedroom, office, and sometimes dining room. By day 3, I'd established a routine that felt almost normal if I didn't think too hard about it. Wake up at dawn. Not by choice, but because sleeping in a car past sunrise invites attention from concerned citizens and police officers. Drive to the 24-hour fitness center where I'd maintained a membership Margaret had encouraged me to keep, for stress relief. Shower, brush my teeth, pretend to be someone who had somewhere important to go. The membership had seemed like an unnecessary expense when I was struggling to pay Margaret's medical bills. Now it felt like a lifeline to dignity. It was at the gym on my 4th morning that I met Rosa Delgado. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She was probably 60, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a neat bun, and clothes that were clean but clearly worn. She moved through her morning routine with the efficiency of someone who'd perfected every motion to conserve energy and time. What struck me most was how invisible she was. Other gym members looked past her as if she were part of the equipment. I recognized the invisibility because I was learning to navigate it myself. "You're new to this," she said quietly, as we were both washing our hands in the locker room. It wasn't a question. I looked at her in the mirror, unsure how she'd known. I thought I'd been blending in reasonably well. "The way you're hoarding toiletries," she explained with a knowing smile. "And you keep checking the time like you have somewhere important to be. People with homes don't treasure gym showers the way we do." "We?" The word came out smaller than I'd intended. "Honey, I've been living in my Toyota for 8 months. Lost. My apartment when the rent doubled and my fixed income couldn't keep up. Too much pride to stay in the shelters. Too old to start over somewhere cheaper." She handed me a travel-sized bottle of decent shampoo. "This place opens at 5 a.m. Most members don't show up until 7. That gives us 2 hours of peace." Rosa became my informal guide to a world I'd never imagined I'd need to navigate. She taught me which coffee shops let you sit for hours if you bought one drink, which libraries had the most comfortable chairs and fastest Wi-Fi, and which neighborhoods were safe to park in after dark. "The key," she explained as we sat in her car sharing a bag of trail mix she'd assembled from bulk bins at 3 different grocery stores, "is to never look desperate. Desperate draws attention, and attention draws trouble. You want to be forgettable." But I was learning that being forgettable felt like dying by degrees. On my 6th day, Rosa introduced me to the ecosystem of Fisherman's Wharf. The tourist area was a careful balance of legitimate businesses, street performers, and people like us who'd learned to survive in the spaces between. "You got any skills?" Rosa asked as we walked past the souvenir shops and seafood restaurants. "I can draw," I said, then immediately felt foolish. Drawing wasn't a survival skill. Rosa stopped, walking. "Show me." I pulled out my old sketchbook, a remnant from my art school days that I'd thrown into one of my boxes almost as an afterthought. I flipped to a portrait I'd drawn of Margaret the previous year, one of the last before her illness made her too tired to sit still. Rosa studied it carefully. "This is good. Really good. You captured something real here." She handed the sketchbook back. "You can make money with this." Within an hour, I was set up on a milk crate borrowed from a friendly produce vendor, my sketchbook open to a fresh page, a cardboard sign propped beside me that read, "Portraits, $20. Rosa had positioned me strategically near the sea lions, where tourists gathered with their phones out, already in the mood to capture memories. My first customer was a middle-aged woman from Ohio, who wanted a drawing of her and her husband with Alcatraz in the background. As I sketched their faces, trying to capture not just their features, but the joy of their vacation, something inside me stirred that had been dormant for years. I was creating something. Not just managing someone else's life or maintaining someone else's dreams, but making something new with my own hands, at my own pace, for my own survival. "Oh my goodness," the woman breathed when I turned the sketchbook around. "It's perfect. It's better than a photograph because it shows how happy we feel." She paid me $25 and insisted I keep the extra $5. "For capturing our joy," she said. That first day, I made $68 drawing portraits of tourists. It wasn't enough to rent an apartment or even a motel room, but it was enough to buy groceries and gas, to feel like I was earning my place in the world rather than begging for it. More importantly, it reminded me that I was still Clara Wren, not just a former caregiver without a home, but the streets taught me other lessons too. On my second week, I was approached by a social services worker who'd noticed me sleeping in my car behind a Starbucks in the Richmond district. "I'm Karen Morrison, from the city's homeless outreach program," she said, her voice carefully trained, in non-threatening compassion. "I wanted to check if you knew about the resources available to you." She was probably my age, dressed in practical clothes with a County of San Francisco badge clipped to her jacket. Her eyes were kind but tired, the exhaustion of someone who cared deeply about problems too big for any one person to solve. "I'm fine," I said automatically, though we both knew it wasn't true. "I have information about transitional housing programs, job placement services, mental health support." She held out a manila folder thick with brochures and forms. I stared at the folder, knowing I should take it, knowing it represented help I desperately needed. But something in me recoiled from the idea of becoming a client, a case file, a problem to be processed through the system. I said I'm fine. Karen didn't push, but she left her business card on my windshield. "Call me when you're ready," she said. "There's no shame in needing help." After she left, I sat in my car holding her card, thinking about pride and shame and the fine line between them. I'd been raised in the foster system, passed between families who saw me as either a burden or a project. I'd spent my adult years being useful to the Taylors, earning my place through service. The idea of accepting charity, of being someone's good deed, felt like erasing what little sense of self I'd managed to build. So I threw the card away and drove back to Fisherman's Wharf to draw more portraits. But the encounter with Karen had shaken something loose in me. That evening, as I sketched in my car by the light of a street lamp, I found myself drawing not tourists, but the faces I'd begun to recognize in my new world. Rosa, whose pride kept her back straight even when she was exhausted. An elderly man, named Frank, who slept in the doorway of a closed bookstore and always wished me good morning when I passed. A young woman about my age who traveled with everything she owned in a grocery cart and had eyes that held stories I didn't know how to ask about. These weren't the faces I'd been trained to see as worthy of art. They weren't posed or prettified, or paying for the privilege of being captured on paper. But there was something in each face that demanded to be witnessed, to be remembered, to be seen as more than just a problem to be solved or avoided. It was sketching Frank's weathered hands when my phone rang. James Taylor's name appeared on the screen. I'd been dreading this call for 2 weeks. "Clara, thank God. Where are you? Dad's been trying to reach you." "I'm sure he has," I said, not believing it for a second. "Look, this whole thing got out of hand. Dad feels terrible about the miscommunication with the property management company. He never intended for you to be without notice." "Miscommunication." I repeated the word flatly. "Come home, Clara. We can work this out." Home. The word hit like a physical blow. "I don't have a home, James. Your father made sure of that." "That's not. It's complicated. Mom left specific instructions, and Dad was trying to honor her wishes. But maybe we misunderstood what she meant." "What did she mean?" A long pause. I think you should hear it from Dad. He's cutting the trip short. He'll be back next week and we can sit down and talk through everything. No, Clara. No, James. I'm not coming back to sit in your living room while your father explains why throwing me out was actually a kindness. I'm not going to pretend this was all a misunderstanding while you decide what scraps of compassion you can afford to offer. You're being unreasonable. I'm being honest. Maybe for the first time in 6 years. I hung up and turned off my phone. Rosa found me the next morning, sitting by the edge of the bay with my sketchbook open to a drawing of the Taylor house I'd started but couldn't finish. Rough night? She asked, settling beside me on the concrete barrier. Someone from my old life called. Wanted me to come back. You going to? I looked at the unfinished sketch. I'd drawn the house perfectly, captured every architectural detail, but I couldn't bring myself to add the people. The windows stared back empty and cold. No, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I'm not. Rosa nodded approvingly. Good. Going backwards never leads anywhere worth being. That afternoon, I set up my portrait station with new resolve. But instead of only drawing tourists, I asked Rosa if she'd pose for me. She laughed at first, but when I showed her the sketch, her expression grew serious. You made me look dignified, she said softly. You are dignified. People don't usually see that. Then they're not really looking. Word spread through the informal network of people who lived on the margins. By the end of the week, I had a small collection of portraits, not of paying customers, but of the faces that were teaching me what resilience actually looked like. Frank, the elderly man who slept in doorways but never missed a sunrise. Maria, the young woman with the grocery cart, who spoke 3 languages and had been a teacher in El Salvador before coming to America with nothing but hope. David, a veteran in his 40s who kept his military bearing despite living in a tent under the freeway overpass. Each drawing taught me something about myself. I was learning to see past the surface, to capture not just features, but the essence of people who had been rendered invisible by circumstances and society's discomfort with their existence. You're getting better, Rosa observed one evening as we shared a dinner assembled from a taco truck and a corner store. Not just at drawing, at being yourself. She was right. For the first time since leaving the Taylor house, I felt like I was moving toward something rather than just away from something. The anger was still there, and the hurt. But underneath it was growing something I'd never felt before. The quiet confidence that came from surviving by my own skills rather than someone else's charity. My phone stayed off for 3 days. When I finally turned it back on, there were 17 missed calls from James and 4 voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize. I deleted them all without listening. Whatever the Taylors wanted to tell me, whatever explanations or justifications they'd prepared, I wasn't ready to hear them. Maybe I never would be. Instead, I opened my sketchbook to a fresh page and began drawing my own face, trying to capture the woman I was becoming rather than the girl I'd been. For the first time in years, I liked what I saw looking back. 2 months into my life on the streets, I had developed what Rosa laughingly called the rhythm of the unrooted. Wake before dawn, drive to the gym for my shower, and 20 minutes of normalcy, then position myself strategically around the city based on weather, tourist flows, and which neighborhoods were having street cleaning days that would force me to relocate my mobile studio. I'd moved beyond Fisherman's Wharf, expanding my territory to include Union Square, the Ferry Building, and on weekends, the Farmers Market in the Mission. Each location brought different faces, different stories, different challenges to capture on paper. My portrait business had evolved from desperate survival to something approaching art. Word of mouth among tourists had been surprisingly effective. Travelers talked to other travelers, and several times I'd had people seek me out based on recommendations from friends who'd visited weeks earlier. I kept a small photo album of my work, both as a portfolio and as proof to potential customers that I could deliver what I promised. But it was the unpaid portraits that were changing me. My collection of street faces had grown to over 40 drawings. Frank, the elderly man who slept in doorways, had become a regular subject. Each sketch captured a different mood, a different day, a different season of survival. Maria, the young woman with the grocery cart, had let me draw her hands, scarred from years of cleaning offices at night, but still graceful as she sorted through donated clothes to find items that fit. Rosa remained my closest friend and harshest critic. She'd appointed herself the guardian of my artistic integrity, making sure I didn't compromise my style to please paying customers. "Don't pretty them up too much," she'd say when I showed her tourist portraits. "You're best when you show people as they really are, not as they want to be." It was Rosa who first noticed Marcus Delacroix watching me work. "That man's been standing by the coffee cart for 20 minutes, she murmured during a break between customers. "Either he's planning to buy a lot of coffee or he's watching you." I looked up from my sketchbook to see a tall, lean man in his early 40s, dressed in the kind of understated expensive clothes that suggested creative profession rather than corporate money. Dark hair with distinguished silver at the temples, keen eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the patient posture of someone accustomed to observing rather than being observed. He approached during my lunch break, when I was sitting on the concrete steps near the Powell Street cable car turnaround, eating a sandwich and sketching the Victorian architecture across the square. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "I'm Marcus Delacroix. I own a gallery in Soma, and I've been watching you work for several days now." My first instinct was suspicion. Street artists learned quickly to be wary of anyone who approached with business propositions. "I'm not doing anything illegal," I said carefully. He smiled. "I'm not suggesting you are. I'm interested in your work. The portraits you do of the homeless community, they're remarkable." I closed my sketchbook protectively. "How do you know about those?" "Rosa Delgado is an old friend of mine. She's been telling me about you for weeks." This revelation hit me like a small earthquake. Rosa had never mentioned knowing anyone in the art world, never suggested that my drawings might have value beyond the $20 I charge tourists. "Rosa knows you?" "My gallery sponsors a monthly community dinner at St. Anthony's. Rosa volunteers there when she can. She showed me photos of your work last week." He sat down on the step below me, careful, not to invade my space. "She was right to be proud of you. You have an extraordinary eye for capturing human dignity." I looked around for Rosa, but she'd disappeared, probably deliberately giving us privacy for this conversation. "What do you want?" I asked. "I'd like to offer you a showing. Nothing major, a corner of my gallery for 2 weeks, maybe 15 to 20 pieces. Your choice of which portraits to include." The offer was so unexpected, so beyond anything I'd imagined, that I couldn't process it immediately. "I don't have 15 to 20 pieces," I said finally. "Rosa tells me you have more than 40. Those aren't for sale. They're personal. Art doesn't have to be for sale to be worth showing. Sometimes the most important exhibitions are the ones that simply ask people to see what they've been overlooking." I studied his face, looking for the angle, the catch, the moment when he'd reveal what he really wanted from me. In my experience, offers that seemed too good to be true usually were. "Why would you do this?" "Because your work matters. Because these faces you're documenting, they're being erased from the city every day. Pushed out by development, ignored by policy, forgotten by people who think homelessness is a choice rather than a circumstance." He pulled a business card from his wallet. "Take some time to think about it, but I hope you'll say yes." After he left, I sat on those steps for another hour, turning his card over in my hands. Marcus Delacroix Gallery, it read in simple, elegant script. Below that, an address in Soma and a phone number. When Rosa reappeared with coffee for both of us, I was ready with questions. "You've been talking to gallery owners about me." I've been bragging about you to anyone who'll listen, she corrected. Marcus is good people, Clara. He's been supporting local artists for 15 years and he doesn't play games. You should have told me you knew him. Would you have believed me if I'd said I had connections in the art world? She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Sometimes the best help is the kind that comes as a surprise. That evening, alone in my car, I spread my portrait drawings across the back seat and tried to see them through Marcus's eyes. Were they really art? Or just the documentary sketches of someone learning to survive? Did it matter? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through social media for the first time in weeks. The Taylors were back from Europe, their Instagram accounts full of photos from their amazing month abroad. Richard posed with wine glasses in Tuscany. James smiled at sidewalk, cafes in Paris. Family dinner photos from their last night in Rome, toasting another incredible adventure together. Not one mention of me. Not one indication that anything had been missing from their perfect family vacation. But as I scrolled through the comments, I found something that made my breath catch. A mutual friend had written, "So glad you all got some family time after. Such a difficult year. How's Clara doing these days?" Richard had responded, "Clara's exploring her own path now. We're very proud of her independence. My independence. As if being thrown out of my home was a graduation gift, a loving push toward self-actualization." I clicked over to James's account, where the photos were similar, but the captions more revealing. Under a shot of the 3 Taylor men at dinner, nothing like European architecture to put life in perspective. Some chapters end, so others can begin. Some chapters end. I was a chapter that had ended. The rage I thought I'd processed came flooding back, sharper and more focused than before. They were treating my homelessness like a successful intervention, as if they'd rescued me from my own lack of ambition, rather than abandoned me when I was no longer useful. I closed the phone and picked up Margaret's locket, the only thing of real value I still owned from my years with the family. She'd given it to me on my 24th birthday, a delicate gold piece that had belonged to her grandmother. "This has been in our family for 4 generations, she'd said, fastening it around my neck with shaking fingers. "I want you to have it because you're the daughter I always wanted, the daughter I never had the chance to raise properly." At the time, those words had felt like the greatest gift anyone had ever given me. Now they felt like a lie that had been carefully constructed to keep me grateful and compliant. But the locket itself, that felt real. The weight of it against my chest. The way Margaret's eyes had filled with tears when she'd placed it there. The genuine love I'd felt in that moment. That couldn't all have been performance, could it? I was still wrestling with these thoughts when Rosa knocked on my car window. She was leaning heavily against a shopping cart filled with her belongings, her usually neat appearance disheveled. "Rosa? What's wrong?" "Got kicked out of my spot," she said, her voice weak. "Property manager called the cops. They towed my car because of unpaid tickets I didn't know I had." I got out and immediately saw that something beyond the immediate crisis was wrong. Rosa's skin had a grayish pallor, and she was breathing more heavily than the situation warranted. "When's the last time you ate?" "This morning. Maybe yesterday morning." She waved off my concern. "I'll be fine. Just need to find somewhere to sleep tonight." But she wasn't fine. Over the next hour, as I helped her find a spot behind a 24-hour laundromat where the owner had agreed she could stay temporarily, it became clear that Rosa was sick in a way that went beyond hunger and exhaustion. "I think you need to see a doctor," I said as I helped her arrange her belongings. "Can't afford a doctor. Can't get to a doctor without a car. The emergency room. Will put me in the system. Social workers, case managers, all of that." She shook her head firmly. "I've stayed independent this long. I'm not becoming a client now." I heard my own words from weeks earlier, my own refusal of Karen Morrison's help. The stubborn pride that kept us suffering rather than accepting assistance felt familiar and foolish. "What if I drive you, just to get checked out?" "You've got your own problems, honey," Rosa, you taught me how to survive out here. You introduced me to Marcus. You've been looking out for me for months. I knelt beside her makeshift bed. Let me look out for you for once. She was quiet for a long time. Okay, but just a checkup. No social workers. The emergency room visit revealed what I'd suspected. Rosa had pneumonia, probably from sleeping in her car during the recent cold. Snap. The doctor wanted to admit her for observation, but Rosa refused. I'll take the antibiotics, she said firmly. But I'm not staying in a hospital bed someone else needs more than I do. I spent the next 3 days shuttling between my portrait work and checking on Rosa, making sure she took her medications, bringing her soup and hot tea, sitting with her when the fever made her restless and disoriented. Caring for Rosa felt different than caring for Margaret had. With Margaret, I'd been motivated by love, but also by obligation, by the fear that if I wasn't indispensable, I might be discarded. With Rosa, there was no expectation of gratitude, no complex family dynamics, no power imbalances, just one person, helping another, because it was the right thing to do. It was the first time I'd ever cared for someone without losing myself in the process. You're different, Rosa said on the 4th day, when her fever had broken and she was sitting up to eat the chicken noodle soup I'd brought from a nearby deli. How so? Stronger. More yourself. She studied my face. Whatever those rich people did to you, it's not defining you anymore. She was right. Somewhere in the weeks of sleeping in my car and drawing faces that mattered, I'd stopped waiting for the Taylors to rescue me, or explain themselves or validate my worth. I'd stopped being the girl who'd been grateful for whatever scraps of family they'd offered. I was Clara Wren, artist and survivor, someone who could take care of herself and others without losing her identity in the process. That realization felt like finding solid ground after months of quicksand. When Rosa was well enough to resume her routine, I made a decision about Marcus's gallery offer. I called him and agreed to the showing, but with conditions. I want the portraits to stay as documentation, not sales pieces, I said. And I want part of the gallery space to be interactive, somewhere people can sit and talk about what they see, maybe share their own stories. That's a beautiful idea, Marcus said. When can you bring me the pieces to review for the show? Next week. I'm still working on a few more, but I wasn't working on more portraits of the homeless community. I was working on something else entirely, a series of drawings that captured the contrast between visible and invisible lives, street faces alongside society faces. The tourists who paid me $20 for flattering portraits next to the people they stepped over on their way to dinner. I was learning to see the whole picture, not just the parts people wanted me to focus on. And for the first time since leaving the Taylor house, I was excited about the future, rather than just surviving the present. The opening night of my exhibition arrived with all the nervous energy of a first date and a job interview combined. Marcus had titled the show, Invisible Voices, Portraits from the Margins, and seeing my name printed on the elegant gallery announcement felt surreal, like someone else's life accidentally intersecting with mine. I'd spent the previous week preparing, selecting 23 portraits from my collection, and writing brief descriptions for each. Not biographical details, which would have felt invasive, but observations about light, expression, the stories that faces tell when we take time to really look. The portrait of Frank read, Dignity, 2024, graphite on paper. There's a difference between being worn down and being broken. This face knows the difference. Rosa's portrait, Resilience, 2024, graphite on paper. Teaching survival is an act of love. Learning it is an act of courage. I'd also included 3 self-portraits from different stages of my homelessness. The first raw and desperate, the second questioning, the third beginning to show the person I was becoming. Marcus had insisted on including them, saying they provided context for the journey both I and viewers were taking. The gallery looked beautiful. Marcus had arranged the lighting to create intimate spaces around each portrait, with small benches positioned to encourage viewers to sit and spend time with the faces rather than just walking past them. In the center of the space, he'd created the interactive area I'd requested, comfortable chairs arranged in a circle with a simple sign, "Share your story." I arrived 2 hours before the opening, wearing the one dress I owned that wasn't wrinkled from living in my car, a simple black sheath I'd bought for Margaret's funeral and hadn't worn since. Rosa had helped me with my hair that afternoon, braiding it into something that looked intentional rather than improvised. "You clean up nice," she said, admiring her handiwork. "But don't forget who you are underneath all that respectability." The first guests began arriving at 6 p.m. I positioned myself near the back of the gallery, nervous about meeting people who would see my work before they knew my story. Marcus had been clear about wanting the art to speak first. I watched a well-dressed couple in their 50s studying Frank's portrait with serious attention. The woman leaned in close, reading my description aloud to her husband. "There's a difference between being worn down and being broken," she read. "This face knows the difference." "The detail in the hands is extraordinary," the man said. "Look at the way she captured the texture of his skin, the calluses, but also the gentleness in how he's holding that book. They didn't know they were talking about a man who slept in doorways and collected cans for recycling money. They just saw the humanity I'd tried to capture, the dignity that circumstances couldn't erase." More people arrived, artists, collectors, neighborhood residents, curious about the new exhibition. I listened to fragments of conversation as I moved through the crowd, staying invisible in my own show. "These aren't sentimental portraits of poverty," a young woman was explaining to her friend. "They're about seeing people as individuals, not as problems." "The technique is sophisticated," an elderly man told Marcus. "Where did you find this artist?" "She found me," Marcus replied with a smile in my direction. It wasn't until 7:30 that I saw him. James Taylor stood at the entrance, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than I'd made in the past month, his eyes scanning the gallery with the careful attention of someone looking for something specific. When his gaze found me, the shock of recognition was mutual. My first instinct was to hide, to slip out the back exit and avoid whatever confrontation he'd come to deliver. But then I looked around at the portraits surrounding us, at faces that had taught me about courage, about dignity in impossible circumstances, about the strength it takes to be seen when the world prefers you invisible. I walked toward him. "Hello, James." "Clara." He looked genuinely surprised, as if he'd expected to find me diminished by the past few months rather than standing in my own art exhibition. I saw the review in the Chronicle. I had to come." "There was a review?" "You didn't see it?" He pulled out his phone and showed me the arts section headline. "New exhibition challenges viewers to see the invisible." I skimmed the article quickly. The reviewer had written about the unflinching humanity of the portraits and the emerging artist's ability to capture dignity in the face of adversity. She'd called my work essential viewing for anyone who wants to understand the real San Francisco, not just the postcard version. "This is incredible, Clara," James said, gesturing around the gallery. "But I'm not here just because of the exhibition. I need to talk to you. There are things about the eviction, about Mom's wishes, that you need to know. I don't want to hear your explanations, James. Not tonight. It's not an explanation. It's the truth, and you deserve to know it." Something in his voice stopped me from walking away. He looked tired, older than when I'd last seen him, and there was something in his expression that reminded me of Margaret during her final weeks. The weight of secrets that needed to be spoken. 5 minutes, I said. He glanced around the crowded gallery. "Can we go somewhere private?" Marcus had given me access to his office for the evening, a small space behind the main gallery where I could store my purse and have a quiet moment if needed. I led James there, leaving the door open so I could hear the conversations continuing about my work in the main space. "Before I say anything else, I need you to know that what happened to you was never supposed to happen the way it did," James began. "Dad handled it badly. We all did. Your father threw me out while you were all in Europe. How was that supposed to happen? You were supposed to have been told about the trust fund first. What trust fund? James reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. This is what I came to give you. What I should have given you months ago. Inside the envelope were legal documents, bank statements, and a letter in handwriting I recognized immediately. Margaret's careful script, though shakier than I remembered. The bank statement was from Wells Fargo, dated 3 months before Margaret's death. Account holder, Clara Wren Trust. Balance, $287,000. I stared at the number until it stopped making sense, then read it again. I don't understand. Mom set up a trust fund for you 2 years ago, James explained quietly. Every payment you made, for her medical bills, she matched and put into the account. She also added money from her own savings, funds from jewelry she sold, and the proceeds from some investments she liquidated. I looked at the statement again. The deposit history showed regular contributions starting 24 months earlier, exactly when I'd begun paying Margaret's medical expenses. She knew about the money I was spending. She knew everything. She also knew that you'd never accept the money if she offered it directly, so she set up the trust to transfer to you after her death. My hand shook as I opened Margaret's letter. Dearest Clara, it began. By the time you read this, I'll be gone, and I hope you'll forgive an old woman's complicated attempt to set things right. I discovered your financial sacrifices months ago. The bank statements, the late-night freelance work, the way you've been skipping meals to pay for treatments I never asked you to cover. At first, I was overwhelmed with gratitude. Then I was horrified. Not because you were helping, but because I realized you might be staying with us out of obligation rather than love. The thought that you were sacrificing your future because you felt trapped by duty to our family broke my heart. So I made a decision that I hope you'll understand, even if you can't forgive it. I arranged for your eviction because I couldn't bear the thought of you wasting your youth taking care of a dying woman when you should be building your own life. I left you this money not as payment for your service, but as an investment in your freedom. I know it will feel like abandonment. I know you'll be angry and hurt and confused, but I also know you're stronger and more talented than you've ever allowed yourself to believe. Sometimes love means letting go, even when, especially when, it breaks our hearts to do it. You were never my employee, Clara. You were never my project or my charity case. You were the daughter I was blessed to love for 6 precious years. And everything I'm doing now is because I want you to have the chance to become who you're meant to be, not who you think we need you to be. Use this money to go back to school, to travel, to start over wherever makes you happy. Use it to remember that you are valuable not because of what you do for others, but because of who you are. All my love, always, Margaret. I read the letter 3 times before I could speak. She evicted me because she loved me? She thought she was setting you free, James said. She made Dad promise to handle the transition carefully, to explain everything, to make sure you knew about the trust fund before you had to leave the guest house. But then she died, and Dad was grieving and angry, and he blamed himself for not seeing how much you were sacrificing. He handled it all wrong. I looked at the bank statement again. Nearly $300,000. More money than I'd ever imagined having. Enough to change everything about my circumstances. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why did you let me think you'd all just forgotten about me? James ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that reminded me painfully of Richard. Because I thought Dad was right. I thought maybe Mom's plan was cruel, that forcing you to struggle would teach you some kind of lesson about independence. I was angry at you for making us all feel guilty about your situation. Angry at me? You were so devoted to Mom, so perfect, and it made the rest of us look selfish by comparison. When she died, it was easier to resent you than to face how inadequately we'd all loved her. The honesty in his admission was startling. I'd spent months thinking the Taylors had discarded me because I no longer served a purpose. The reality was more complicated. They'd pushed me away because my love for Margaret highlighted their own shortcomings. But seeing you tonight, James continued, seeing what you've accomplished, the art you're creating, the person you've become, Mom was right. You needed to leave us to find yourself. I walked to the office window, which overlooked the gallery space where people were still studying my portraits, still engaging with the stories I'd captured. I could see Rosa near the interactive seating area, talking animatedly with a younger woman about something they'd both seen in one of the drawings. I don't know if I can forgive her, I said finally, or any of you. I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking you to take what's rightfully yours. I turned back to James, holding the bank documents. What if I don't want it? What if accepting this money feels like validating what she did to me? Then don't accept it. Let it sit in the account until you decide what feels right. But don't reject it out of spite, Clara. Don't let your anger at us prevent you from having choices. Through the office window, I watched Marcus talking with a couple who were clearly interested in commissioning a portrait. I saw Frank himself, who'd somehow heard about the exhibition and come dressed in his best clothes, standing proud and amazed in front of his own image rendered in charcoal and respect. I thought about the past 3 months. The fear, the hunger, the nights sleeping in my car, the gradual discovery of my own strength and artistic voice. I thought about the person I'd been in the Taylor house, useful and grateful and small, always worried about earning my place at their table. Then I thought about the person I was now, standing in my own art exhibition, surrounded by work that mattered, connected to a community that saw and valued me for who I was, rather than what I could do for them. Margaret was right about one thing, I said to James. I did need to leave, but not because I was trapped by obligation. Because I was comfortable being invisible, and comfortable doesn't lead to growth. So you'll take the money? I'll take some of it. Enough to get an apartment, maybe buy a reliable car. The rest, I looked around the gallery space, thinking about Rosa's recovery, about Frank's pride tonight, about all the faces that had taught me what it meant to be seen. The rest is going to fund something Margaret would have approved of. James smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him all evening. What's that? An art studio for people who've been forgotten. A place where being invisible doesn't have to be permanent. As James left the gallery, he turned back one more time. For what it's worth, Clara, I think you're exactly who Mom hoped you'd become. After he was gone, I sat alone in Marcus's office, holding Margaret's letter and trying to reconcile the woman who'd written those words with the woman who'd sent me into homelessness as an act of love. Maybe forgiveness wasn't something that happened all at once. Maybe it was something you worked toward, one day at a time, like learning to draw faces that revealed truth instead of just surface beauty. Maybe Margaret had been wrong about a lot of things, but right about the one that mattered most. I was stronger than I'd ever allowed myself to believe, and now I had the resources to prove it. The morning after the gallery opening, I woke up in my car for what I hoped would be the last time. The bank documents sat on my passenger seat like a pile of possibilities, some welcome, some terrifying, all requiring decisions I'd never imagined having to make. $287,000. The number still felt abstract, like monopoly money or a typo that would be corrected by some bank officer who'd realized they'd made a mistake. But the documents were real. Margaret's letter was real, and most importantly, the choice of what to do next was entirely mine. That freedom felt more overwhelming than homelessness had. I drove to the gym for my morning shower, but this time the routine felt different. Instead of the desperate necessity it had been for months, it was simply hygiene, a normal person taking care of herself before starting her day. The shift in perspective was subtle but profound. Rosa was waiting for me in the parking lot when I came out, sitting on a bench with 2 cups of coffee and a bag of pastries from the bakery down the street. Figured you might need some processing time after last night, she said, handing me a coffee. That was quite a revelation. You heard? Honey, half the gallery heard. That boy didn't exactly whisper. She studied my face carefully. How are you feeling about it all? I sat beside her on the bench, warming my hands around the coffee cup. Confused, angry, relieved, guilty for feeling relieved. I took a sip of coffee, buying time to organize my thoughts. She loved me enough to set me free, but she didn't trust me enough to make my own choices. Love makes people do complicated things, Rosa said. Doesn't mean their intentions were pure, doesn't mean their methods were right, but maybe it means you can stop carrying their mistakes as your burden. Over the next week, I began the surreal process of transitioning from homelessness to financial stability. I found a small apartment in the Mission District. Nothing fancy, but clean and safe with large windows that would be perfect for an art studio. The landlord, a middle-aged woman who owned several buildings in the neighborhood, didn't bat an eye when I paid 6 months' rent up front in cash. Artist? She asked, noting the easel and art supplies I was carrying. Yes. Good. This neighborhood needs more artists, keeps the soul alive while everything else changes. Setting up my own space after months of living in my car felt like learning to walk again. I spent hours arranging and rearranging my few possessions, trying to create something that felt like home rather than just shelter. The leather journal that had traveled with me from the foster system to the Taylor house to the streets now sat on a proper desk by the window, ready to document this new chapter. But the apartment was just the foundation. The real work was planning, the art studio for the community that had shaped me during my months on the streets. I'd been thinking about the project since the conversation with James, but now I had to turn the idea into reality. The concept was ambitious, a space where people experiencing homelessness could come to create art, tell their stories, and most importantly, be seen as artists rather than problems to be solved. I started by visiting existing programs around the city, learning what worked and what didn't. The Coalition on Homelessness had an art therapy program that met once a week in a church basement. The Tenderloin Museum ran storytelling workshops for residents of single-occupancy hotels. St. Anthony's dining room had a corner where people could sketch while they waited for meals. All of these programs were valuable, but they were also temporary, a few hours here and there, fitting art around the more pressing needs of survival. I wanted to create something permanent, a place where creativity could be the primary focus, rather than an afterthought. The space I found was a former auto repair shop in the Mission, a large open area with good light and high ceilings. The owner was willing to lease it at below market rate because he was interested in community development rather than maximum profit. I grew up in this neighborhood, he told me as we walked through the empty building. My family came here from El Salvador with nothing, and this community helped us build something. If your project helps other people build something too, then I want to be part of it. The lease negotiations took 2 weeks, during which I found myself relying on skills I developed during my years managing the Taylor household, reading contracts, negotiating terms, thinking strategically about budgets and timelines. The experience was empowering in a way I hadn't expected. I wasn't just an artist with a dream. I was a businesswoman creating an organization. While I worked on the practical aspects of the studio, I continued my portrait work, but with a new purpose. Instead of just documenting the faces I encountered, I was now specifically seeking out people who might be interested in participating in the art program once it launched. I found Miguel, a veteran in his 50s who'd been living in Golden Gate Park and had been sketching bird patterns in the dirt with sticks. When I showed him my portfolio, his eyes lit up with recognition. "I used to draw," he said quietly. "Before the war, before everything went sideways. Haven't touched a pencil in 15 years. Would you like to try again?" I don't know if I remember how. That's the beautiful thing about art, I told him. Your hands remember even when your mind thinks it's forgotten. I met Sarah, a young woman about my age who'd been living in her car with her 6-year-old daughter, Emma. Sarah had been a graphic design student before medical bills from Emma's asthma treatments forced her to drop out and eventually lose her housing. Emma loves to draw, Sarah told me as we sat in the children's section of the main library, where they spent most of their days. She's always asking me to help her make pictures, but I don't have supplies, and I feel like I've failed her as a mother in so many ways already. Sarah's story resonated with me in ways that were almost painful. Like me, she'd been forced to abandon her dreams because of circumstances beyond her control. But unlike me, she was carrying the additional weight of trying to protect a child from the worst consequences of their situation. I used to design logos for small businesses, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Had my own little freelance practice going, was building toward something real. Then Emma got sick, really sick, and the insurance wouldn't cover the specialist visits or the new medications. I spent everything I had trying to keep her healthy, sold my computer, my design software, everything. Emma looked up from her coloring book, her large brown eyes serious beyond her years. She'd been listening to adult conversations about survival for so long that she'd learned to gauge the emotional temperature of every discussion. Mama draws beautiful pictures, Emma said quietly. She draws them on napkins when we go to McDonald's. You haven't failed her, I said, watching Emma carefully color within the lines of a library coloring book. And maybe we can help each other. The conversation with Sarah planted the seed for what would become one of the studio's most important programs, childcare integrated with art instruction, so parents wouldn't have to choose between pursuing their creativity and caring for their children. The most challenging conversation was with Frank, whose portrait had become one of the most discussed pieces in my gallery exhibition. He was initially skeptical about the entire project. I'm not a charity case, he said firmly when I explained my plans. Don't need anyone feeling sorry for me or trying to fix me with art therapy. This isn't charity, I replied. This is about recognizing that you're already an artist. You arrange those books you collect in patterns that are beautiful. You choose which doorways to sleep in based on the architectural details that appeal to you. You're making aesthetic choices every day. I'm just offering you better tools. It took 3 more conversations before Frank agreed to consider participating, and only after I promised that the studio would be run by and for the community it served, not imposed on them by well-meaning outsiders. As the physical space took shape, I realized I needed help with the administrative and programming aspects. I contacted Marcus, who connected me with other artists and community organizers who had experience with similar projects. Through those connections, I met David Chen, a social worker who specialized in art therapy programs for underserved populations. He was immediately enthusiastic about the concept. Most programs like this are run by people who mean well, but don't have lived experience with homelessness, he told me during our first planning meeting. The fact that you've been where your participants are now, that changes everything about how you'll approach the work. David agreed to help with program development and volunteer coordination, but he insisted that I remain the primary director. This is your vision, he said. My job is to help you make it sustainable, not to take it over. 3 weeks into the planning process, I received an unexpected phone call from Richard Taylor. Clara, I hope you don't mind me calling. His voice was careful, formal. James told me about your art exhibition and your plans for the community studio. I wanted to reach out and offer my support. The conversation felt surreal. Richard Taylor, the man who'd orchestrated my eviction, was offering to help fund the project that had grown out of the homelessness he'd created. I don't think that's appropriate, I said. I understand why you'd feel that way. But Margaret would have loved this project, Clara. It honors everything she believed about art and community and helping people find their voices. Margaret also believed in abandoning people as an act of love. A long pause. I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But don't let your anger toward us prevent you from accepting help that could benefit the people you're trying to serve. I thought about that conversation for days. Was Richard's offer genuine support? Or was it an attempt to assuage his guilt? Did his motivations matter if the money could help create something meaningful for the community? In the end, I decided to accept a small contribution from the Taylor Family Foundation, enough to purchase some equipment and supplies, but not enough to make me dependent on their continued support. I wanted the studio to succeed on its own terms, not as an extension of their charity. The most difficult part of the preparation wasn't the logistics or the funding, or even the emotional complexity of working with my former family. It was facing my own doubts about whether I was the right person to lead this project. Late at night in my apartment, sketching out ideas for programming and workshop schedules, I'd be struck by waves of uncertainty. Who was I to think I could create something meaningful? I'd been homeless for 3 months, hardly enough time to understand the complexities of the issues I was trying to address. I was an art school dropout who'd learned to draw portraits at tourist spots. What made me think I could run a community? Organization? The imposter syndrome felt crushing some nights. I'd wake up at 3 a.m, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if I opened the studio and no one came? What if people came but the programming was inadequate? What if I was just another well-meaning person who thought good intentions were enough to solve complex problems? I started keeping a list of my qualifications, trying to build confidence through facts rather than feelings. I had lived experience with homelessness. I had artistic skills that I'd proven could generate income. I had 6 years of experience managing complex household operations for the Taylors. I had built relationships within the homeless community, based on mutual respect rather than charity. But the voice of doubt was persistent. During one particularly difficult night, I called the suicide prevention hotline, not because I was suicidal, but because I needed to talk to someone trained to listen without judgment. "I'm starting something important," I told the counselor, "but I'm terrified I'm not qualified to do it right. Tell me about what makes it important," she said. As I explained the studio concept, the community I'd met, the faces I'd drawn, I heard something in my own voice that I hadn't noticed before. Conviction. Despite my fears, I believed in what I was creating. The doubt was about my abilities, not about the need for the program. "It sounds like you're exactly the right person to lead this," the counselor said. "Not because you have all the answers, but because you're asking the right questions." That conversation helped me understand that my uncertainty wasn't a weakness. It was evidence that I took the responsibility seriously. But then I'd remember Frank's pride at seeing his portrait in the gallery. I'd think about Miguel's eyes lighting up when he talked about drawing again. I'd recall Sarah's quiet desperation to give her daughter opportunities she couldn't afford. I wasn't qualified to fix homelessness or solve systemic problems. But I was qualified to see people who'd been rendered invisible, to create space for stories that needed telling, to remember what it felt like to be forgotten, and ensure that others didn't have to face that invisibility alone. 2 months after the gallery opening, I was ready to launch Invisible Voices Art Studio. The space was complete. Workstations with good lighting, supplies organized and accessible, a small gallery area where participants could display their work, and a comfortable seating area for group discussions and community meetings. I'd recruited 5 core participants: Frank, Miguel, Sarah and Emma, Rosa, and Maria, the young woman with the grocery cart who turned out to have trained as a muralist in El Salvador. David had helped me develop a schedule of workshops and open studio time that would accommodate different schedules and comfort levels. The opening was scheduled for a Saturday morning in late June. I spent the Friday night before making final preparations, arranging supplies, and checking that everything was ready. The evening before the opening, I hosted a private preview for the core participants and their families. Rosa arrived wearing a dress I'd never seen before, her hair styled in an elegant updo that made her look like the retired teacher she'd once been. Frank came with a small bouquet of flowers he'd somehow acquired, presenting them with the formal courtesy of a gentleman caller. Miguel brought sketches he'd been working on, the first drawings he'd completed in 15 years. They were tentative, shaky, but alive with the muscle memory of someone who'd once known how to translate vision into line and shadow. Sarah arrived with Emma, who immediately claimed one of the child-sized easels I'd purchased specifically for young participants. "This is for me?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's for anyone who wants to create something beautiful," I replied. As we all stood in the studio that evening, surrounded by the tools and space that would make art possible, I felt the weight of Margaret's complicated gift in a new way. She'd pushed me out of comfort and safety, yes, but she'd also pushed me toward this moment, the opportunity to create something that honored both my pain and my healing. "Tomorrow we begin," I said to the small group gathered around me. "Not just the studio, but a new way of being seen." As I locked up the studio that evening, I realized this was the moment Margaret had been pushing me toward when she'd arranged my eviction. Not the trust fund or the financial security, but this. The opportunity to create something meaningful from my own experience, to transform my understanding of invisibility into a platform for helping others be seen. I pulled out my phone and composed a text message to James. "The studio opens tomorrow. Margaret would be proud of what her complicated love made possible." His response came quickly. "She would be proud of who you've become." For the first time since reading Margaret's letter, I thought that might actually be true. But first, I had to prove it to myself. The opening day of Invisible Voices Art Studio arrived with the kind of crisp June morning that made San Francisco feel like a city of endless possibilities. I arrived at 7 a.m., 2 hours before our scheduled opening, needing time to center myself before what I hoped would be a transformative day for everyone involved. The studio looked perfect in the morning light streaming through the large windows. Workstations were arranged in clusters that encouraged collaboration while allowing for privacy. Child-friendly spaces were clearly marked with colorful tape on the floor. The small gallery area displayed some of the work our core participants had created during our preparation weeks: Miguel's tentative bird sketches, Rosa's powerful self-portrait, Frank's architectural studies of the doorways that had sheltered him. But the centerpiece was something I'd been working on in secret for the past month. A large collaborative piece I'd started and invited each participant to add to over time. The canvas showed San Francisco's skyline, but instead of the typical postcard view, it depicted the city as seen from street level. Doorways, bus stops, park benches, the places where invisible people carved out moments of rest and dignity. Each person had added their own element. Frank had detailed the architectural features of buildings. Rosa had painted figures of people helping each other. Miguel had added birds, symbols of freedom and possibility. Sarah had contributed clean, graphic elements that showed her design background, while Emma had added flowers and sunshine that only a child would think to include in a scene about homelessness. The painting told the story of our community, and today it would be revealed to the public for the first time. By 8:30, local media had begun arriving. I'd sent press releases to arts publications and homeless advocacy organizations, hoping for modest coverage. I hadn't expected the response. We'd received 3 television stations, 2 newspaper reporters, and a photographer from SF Weekly. "Clara Wren?" A young woman with a press badge approached me. "I'm Jennifer Martinez from the Chronicle. I covered your gallery exhibition at the Delacroix space last month. This is an incredible evolution of that work." "Thank you. But today isn't about me. It's about the community we've built, and the art that emerges when people have space to be seen." "Can you tell me about the inspiration for the studio?" I looked around at the space filling with participants, volunteers, and curious neighborhood residents. Rosa was already at work on a new piece, completely absorbed in her process. Frank was showing a group of visitors his technique for capturing architectural details. Sarah was helping Emma mix colors at the child-friendly station. The inspiration was learning that being invisible isn't a choice, I said. When circumstances push you to society's margins, you don't disappear. You just become harder to see. This studio is about changing the perspective, helping people recognize that everyone has a story worth telling, art worth making, dignity worth honoring. More people continued to arrive throughout the morning. Marcus Delacroix came with several collectors who'd been interested in purchasing portraits from my previous exhibition. David Chen brought colleagues from the social services community. Neighbors from the surrounding blocks stopped by out of curiosity and stayed to engage with the work being created. The energy was electric. Conversations were happening at every workstation, not just about technique or supplies, but about the stories behind the art being created. I watched a well-dressed woman in her 60s spend 20 minutes talking with Miguel about his military service and how drawing helped him process his experiences. A young father brought his son to meet Emma, and the children immediately began collaborating on a mural depicting their favorite animals. This was what I'd dreamed of, a space where the artificial barriers between housed and unhoused, successful and struggling, visible and invisible, broke down in the face of shared creativity. But it was also overwhelming. As the director of the program, I felt responsible for every interaction, every moment of the experience. I moved through the space like a nervous host, checking on supplies, facilitating introductions, answering questions about our mission and methods. It was Rosa who finally pulled me aside around noon. "You need to breathe," she said, leading me to a quiet corner. "This is beautiful, Clara. Let yourself enjoy it instead of managing it to death." She was right. I'd been so focused on ensuring the day went perfectly that I'd forgotten to appreciate what we'd actually accomplished. Looking around the studio with fresh eyes, I saw not just a successful opening, but a functioning community. People were creating, connecting, sharing stories that might never have been told otherwise. That's when I saw him. Richard Taylor stood near the entrance, wearing his expensive casual clothes and the carefully composed expression he used when he wasn't sure of his reception. He was studying our collaborative cityscape painting with intense attention, reading the small placard I'd written explaining how each participant had contributed to the piece. My first instinct was to hide, to slip out the back exit and avoid whatever conversation he'd come to have. But then I remembered where I was, in a space I'd created, surrounded by a community I'd helped build, engaged in work that mattered. This was my territory now, not his. I walked toward him with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Richard. He turned, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Uncertainty. Richard Taylor, successful attorney and master of controlled environments, looked genuinely nervous. "Clara, this is remarkable." He gestured around the studio. "James told me about your project, but seeing it in person..." "What are you doing here?" I came to apologize, and to try to understand what Margaret saw that I missed. The conversation was happening in the middle of the busy studio, with people creating art and sharing stories all around us. Several people had noticed Richard's arrival. His expensive clothes and formal bearing made him stand out in our community of artists who'd learned to make beauty from scarcity. "I don't need your apology," I said. "I'm past needing your validation or your guilt." "I know. That's what makes it necessary to give." A small crowd had begun to gather around us, sensing the tension of an important conversation. I saw Jennifer Martinez, the Chronicle reporter, approaching with her notepad. The morning's media coverage had been positive, but I realized this moment could define how the story of the studio was told. "Maybe we should talk privately," Richard said, noticing the attention we were drawing. "No, whatever you came to say, you can say it here. These people." I gestured to the artists and visitors surrounding us. "They're my community now. They've earned the right to hear this." Richard looked uncomfortable with the public nature of the moment, but something in my voice must have convinced him to proceed. "I was wrong," he said. "About everything. About how I handled Margaret's death. About the eviction. About assuming you needed to be managed rather than supported." He paused, looking around at the faces watching our exchange. But mostly I was wrong about thinking you were dependent on our family when the truth was, we were dependent on you. You threw me out while you went on vacation. I did, because I was angry and grieving, and I blamed you for making me feel guilty about how little I'd contributed to Margaret's care. You were everything she needed me to be, and I resented you for it. The honesty in his admission surprised me. This wasn't the careful, calculated apology I'd expected. This was raw acknowledgement of his failures. Margaret arranged the eviction because she wanted me to find my own path, I said. But you handled it in the cruelest way possible. Yes, I did. He looked directly at me, no longer scanning the crowd. I wanted to hurt you because you reminded me of my own inadequacy. That was unforgivable. Jennifer Martinez had moved closer, clearly taking notes. Other media representatives were paying attention now, realizing they were witnessing something significant. The question is, I said, what do you want from me now? Nothing. I want to give you something. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. This is the deed to the guesthouse property. Margaret always intended for you to have it, but I've been holding on to it out of spite. It's yours now, free and clear. I stared at the envelope, not taking it immediately. The guesthouse, the space that had been my home for 6 years, the place where I'd felt like family, the site of my abandonment. I don't want it. Clara, I don't want your property, Richard. I don't want your money or your guilt or your attempts to rewrite history. I gestured around the studio, at the artists working, at the community we'd built. This is my home now. These people are my family. You can't fix what you broke by giving me things I don't need. A murmur went through the crowd. I could see people nodding in agreement, understanding the power dynamics at play, even if they didn't know the full history. Then what can I do? Richard asked. You can leave. You can stop trying to manage the consequences of your choices and let me live the life I've built. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of months of anger and hurt. You can accept that. Margaret was right. I needed to be free of your family to become who I was meant to be. And who is that? I looked around the studio again, at Rosa teaching a watercolor technique to a teenager from the neighborhood, at Frank helping a curious visitor understand the structural elements of the building we were in, at Sarah and Emma working side by side on a piece that combined professional design skills with a child's uninhibited creativity. I'm Clara Wren, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the studio. I'm an artist, a community organizer, and someone who believes that being forgotten doesn't have to be permanent. I create spaces where invisible people become visible, where stories that matter get told, where dignity gets recognized regardless of circumstances. The crowd around us had grown to include most of the people in the studio. I realized this had become an impromptu speech, a public declaration of who I'd become and what I stood for. I learned to see people differently, because I know what it feels like to be unseen, I continued. I learned to value community, because I know what it means to be abandoned. I learned to create beauty from struggle, because I had to transform my pain into something that could help others. Several people began to applaud, but I held up my hand to continue. This studio exists because I was homeless. This community exists because I was forgotten. This art exists because I learned that being invisible is only temporary if you refuse to stay that way. I looked directly at Richard. So thank you for evicting me. Thank you for forcing me to discover who I am when I'm not trying to earn my place in someone else's story. The applause this time was sustained and heartfelt. I saw tears in Rosa's eyes, pride in Frank's expression, wonder in Emma's face as she processed the adult conversation she was witnessing. Richard nodded slowly, understanding that this was both an acceptance of his apology and a dismissal. He placed the envelope on a nearby table and headed toward the exit, but stopped at the door. Margaret would be proud of who you've become, he said. I know, I replied, but I don't need her approval anymore. I don't need anyone's. After Richard left, the energy in the studio shifted. The confrontation had clarified something for everyone present. This wasn't just an art program or a social service initiative. This was a movement, a declaration that society's forgotten people deserve to be seen, heard, and valued. People began approaching me with stories of their own transformations. A woman named Patricia, who'd been quietly working on a watercolor in the corner, revealed that she'd been living in her car for 6 months after losing her job as a librarian. "I haven't painted since college," she said, showing me a delicate landscape that captured the view from the parking lot where she'd been sleeping. "But being here today, seeing what you've all created, it reminded me that I'm still an artist, no matter where I sleep at night." A teenager named Carlos, who'd wandered in with his grandmother, asked if the studio would be open for people his age who were aging out of foster care. "I've been worrying about what happens when I turn 18 next month," he said. "This place makes it seem like maybe there's somewhere I could belong." These conversations were exactly what I'd hoped for. Connections being made, possibilities being recognized, isolation being transformed into community. The rest of the day passed in a blur of interviews, demonstrations, and connections. The Chronicle reporter spent 2 hours documenting different artists' stories. A local television station filmed a segment about innovative approaches to homelessness advocacy. Several community organizations asked about partnerships and expansion, possibilities. Marcus Delacroix approached me near the end of the day with news that would change everything. "3 collectors have asked about commissioning work from your studio participants," he said. "Not charity purchases, but legitimate art sales. They want to buy Frank's architectural studies, Miguel's bird series, and Rosa's portraits. How much are we talking about?" "Enough to fund the studio for 6 months, maybe longer if we price the work appropriately." The idea that our participants could earn real income from their art, that they could be valued as professional artists rather than charity cases, felt like the ultimate validation of everything we were trying to accomplish. But the most meaningful moment came near closing time, when Frank approached me with a piece he'd been working on all day. "This is for you," he said, handing me a detailed drawing of the studio's interior, complete with every workstation, every person who'd participated that day, every conversation that had taken place. It was a masterpiece of observation and memory, capturing not just the physical space, but the emotional energy of the day. "It's beautiful, Frank." "It's documentation," he corrected. "So you remember that today you proved something important, that being forgotten doesn't define you. Fighting back from being forgotten does." As I locked up the studio that evening, I realized I'd accomplished something I'd never imagined when I first slept in my car behind a Starbucks. I'd transformed my pain into purpose, my invisibility into advocacy, my abandonment into a chosen family of artists and dreamers and survivors. The scared girl who'd packed her life into suitcases and driven away from Vallejo Street was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth, who'd created something meaningful from nothing, who'd learned that being seen was something you could choose for yourself and others. Margaret had been right about needing to leave the Taylor family, to find myself, but she'd been wrong about the method. Love doesn't abandon people, even with good intentions. Love creates spaces where people can discover who they're meant to be, with support, dignity, and community. I'd learned the difference, and now I was teaching it to others. Tomorrow, we would continue. 6 months later, I stood in the expanded, Invisible Voices art studio, holding the brass keys that had become the symbol of everything I'd built from nothing. The original space had grown to include 2 additional rooms, one for advanced workshops, another for childcare during art sessions. The walls displayed dozens of pieces created by our community of artists, some for sale, others simply for the joy of being seen. Rosa had become my co-director, her years of life experience perfectly complementing my passion for the work. She stood near the morning coffee station, greeting participants with the same warmth she'd once shown me in those early days when survival felt like the only goal worth pursuing. "Good morning, Clara," called Frank from his favorite corner, where he was working on architectural studies that now sold regularly through Marcus's gallery. His portrait series, Doorways That Sheltered Me, had been featured in Art Forum magazine, bringing national attention to both his work and our program. Sarah had secured an apartment 3 blocks away and was building a freelance design practice while volunteering at the studio. Emma attended the after-school program we'd started, her artwork growing more sophisticated as her mother's confidence returned. They were a family again, but stronger than before. Miguel's bird paintings had become meditation tools for other veterans dealing with trauma. He led weekly sessions where art became therapy, where shared experience became healing. His gentle guidance helped others find the same peace he'd discovered in creating beauty from pain. The morning routine had become sacred to me. I'd arrive early, unlock the doors, start the coffee, and arrange supplies while the city woke up around us. The ritual grounded me in gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. From the scared girl evicted while her family vacationed, to the woman who'd learned that being forgotten was the first step toward choosing to be remembered. My leather journal now sat filled with entries documenting not just survival, but growth, community, and purpose. The final entry read, "Today marks 6 months since we opened. 43 people have participated in our programs. 12 have secured housing. 7 have sold their artwork professionally. But the real success isn't measured in numbers. It's measured in dignity restored, stories honored, and community created where isolation once lived." Margaret's locket still hung around my neck, but its meaning had evolved. It no longer represented the family I'd lost, but the reminder that love, real love, creates space for growth rather than demanding gratitude. I walked to the window overlooking the street where invisible people moved through their days, and I smiled. Some of them would find their way to our doors. Some would discover that being unseen was temporary, that art could make anyone visible, that community could be chosen rather than inherited. I was Clara Wren, no longer invisible, no longer forgotten, no longer afraid of being exactly who I was meant to be. And tomorrow, like every single day, I would unlock these doors again. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.